Recovered data fragments from Frontier Archive vaults describe a pattern of anomalous heraldry appearing along the outer marches of the Segmentum Pacificus. The material was not preserved through formal administratum channels, but rather through piecemeal transcriptions, partial auger recordings, and damage pit captures gathered from long-abandoned monitoring stations. Several of these installations showed signs of deliberate signal redirection prior to their loss, suggesting that the information was neither accidental nor widely intended for dissemination. Witness accounts attached to these fragments remain unusually consistent despite originating from isolated systems separated by considerable warp distance. Observers recorded the arrival of warships bearing markings that resembled those of the Raven Guard Legion during the Great Crusade era, yet altered in tone and configuration. The iconography displayed predatory adaptations, including talon motifs rendered in pale coloration against void dark hulls. No corresponding fleet registrations exist within surviving Imperial Navy registries. Additional records recovered from Voidfarer guilds mention transactions conducted under strict silence protocols, with gene-enhanced warriors exchanging protection or material without invoking Imperial authority. These encounters were brief, calculated, and devoid of attempts at reintegration. Cross-analysis of linguistic patterns, armor configuration, and genetic indicators led archivists to classify these forces under a single designation preserved in fragmented expedition logs, the Ashen Claws. The earliest confirmed origins of this group trace back to the closing stages of the Horus Heresy, when the Raven Guard Legion was already operating in a state of severe depletion. The Legion had suffered catastrophic losses during the Dropsite massacre on Istvan V, an event that destroyed much of its command structure and material strength. In the aftermath, the surviving elements of the Legion were forced into a prolonged phase of reconstruction, relying heavily upon accelerated gene seed production and rapid induction of new warriors. This process, overseen by Primarch Corvus Corax, was conducted under extreme strategic pressure. The Imperium required immediate replenishment of forces, yet the methods employed to achieve this recovery introduced instability. Experimental implantation techniques, reliance on incomplete genetic templates, and the urgency of wartime necessity produced warriors who diverged in subtle but significant ways from the Legion's original Terran and Deliverance-born stock. Among these reconstructed formations were several expeditionary contingents created to operate beyond the direct oversight of the Primarch. Their purpose was pragmatic. They were intended to continue prosecuting the war against traitor forces across distant theatres while the core of the Legion stabilized. These detachments retained Raven Guard doctrine emphasizing stealth, sudden violence, and strategic isolation, but they developed increasingly autonomous command cultures due to the distances involved and the fractured state of Imperial communications during the Heresy. As the wider conflict drew to its conclusion, and the Imperium transitioned into the reorganization that followed the Siege of Terra, many such forces were formally recalled or reassigned into the new chapter structure mandated by the Codex Astartes. Yet not all formations returned. Warp storms, navigational collapse, and the sheer administrative overload of a wounded Imperium resulted in certain units operating beyond the reach of centralized authority for extended periods. One such formation, composed of Raven Guard descendants and later reinforcements drawn from related gene lines, established a semi-permanent operational zone along the galactic fringe. Initially, this was a matter of survival. Supply chains were non-existent. Astropathic contact was unreliable. The warriors were compelled to secure resources independently, defend isolated human populations, and maintain their own war material without Mechanicus oversight. Over time, necessity evolved into identity. These Space Marines ceased to consider themselves a temporary extension of the Legion, and instead developed a distinct operational culture rooted in self-sufficiency and predatory adaptation. Their armor schemes shifted from the sable black of the Raven Guard to a pale ash-toned coloration. This alteration was both practical and symbolic. It reduced visual detection in the dust-heavy environments common to the frontier worlds they defended, while also signifying their separation from the parent formation that no longer guided them. Genetic analysis conducted centuries later by unauthorized Mechanicus observers suggested that their gene seed remained broadly stable, though marked by minor deviations consistent with early post-Istvan reconstruction strains. These deviations did not manifest in the catastrophic mutations seen in certain other legions, but they reinforced the perception that the group existed outside the carefully monitored genetic economy of the Imperium. The warriors who would become known as the Ashen Claws organized themselves around a loose but effective hierarchy. Command authority was earned through demonstrated capability, rather than strict adherence to codex-prescribed structure. Veteran leaders maintained continuity of doctrine, emphasizing reconnaissance, precision strikes, and calculated intimidation rather than large-scale engagements. Their fleets remained comparatively small, but highly mobile, relying on rapid translation and sudden concentration of force. Their relationship with nearby human settlements was complex. They did not rule as planetary governors nor withdraw entirely as distant guardians. Instead, they acted as conditional protectors. Worlds under their watch were expected to provide logistical support, raw materials, and in some cases aspirants suitable for induction. In return, the Ashen Claws eliminated external threats with ruthless efficiency. Xenos raiders, renegade human factions, and opportunistic pirates found little warning before annihilation. Unlike many Codex-compliant chapters, they did not maintain extensive fortress monasteries or ceremonial infrastructure. Their presence was primarily void-based. Strike cruisers and adapted escort vessels served as both home and arsenal. This mobility allowed them to avoid entanglement with Imperial bureaucracy, which by the early post-Heresy centuries had grown increasingly rigid. It is important to note that there is no surviving decree formally declaring their secession. No record exists of open rebellion, denunciation, or ideological schism comparable to those that defined the traitor legions. Instead, their separation appears to have been gradual, shaped by isolation and reinforced by mutual indifference. The Imperium, vast and wounded, did not pursue every lost fragment. The fragment in turn did not seek rediscovery. Cultural divergence followed operational independence. Oral traditions preserved among their ranks emphasized survival, adaptability, and the rejection of what they perceived as distant and impractical authority. They retained reverence for the Emperor of Mankind, but this veneration was expressed through action rather than liturgical observance. Ritual became functional, stripped of the elaborate ecclesiastical layers that later defined much of Imperial practice. Their wargear reflected similar pragmatism. Armor was maintained beyond standard replacement cycles, repaired and modified repeatedly by their own artificers. Weapons were selected for reliability and ease of maintenance, rather than adherence to standardized issue patterns. Over generations, this produced a visual and technological identity that appeared archaic to outside observers, yet remained lethally effective. Recruitment practices also adapted to frontier realities. Rather than drawing from a single homeworld population, they selected candidates from multiple protectorate systems. This broadened genetic diversity while binding those worlds more closely to their guardians. Aspirants were subjected to trials focused less on ceremonial endurance and more on practical survival skills such as void navigation, environmental adaptation, and independent combat operation. Despite these changes, core Raven Guard tactical heritage endured. Engagement records consistently demonstrate preference for infiltration, misdirection, and elimination of command structures before open battle commenced. Enemy forces often reported confusion, communications collapse, and targeted leadership casualties within the opening moments of conflict. Only afterward did the main assault materialize, precise and overwhelming. The broader Imperium remained only dimly aware of their existence for centuries. When references did appear, they were frequently misclassified as isolated Raven Guard successors or entirely unverified Astartes activity. This ambiguity served the Ashen Claws well. It allowed them to operate without the scrutiny that might have forced compliance or confrontation. By the time Imperial records began to stabilize in the later millennia, the group had already entrenched itself as a semi-autonomous power along the galactic edge. They were neither formally recognised as a chapter nor condemned as renegades. Instead, they occupied an uncertain category that defied the administrative clarity the Imperium preferred but could not always enforce. This ambiguity became the defining characteristic of their early history. They were born from loyalty, shaped by abandonment, and sustained through adaptation. Their continued existence demonstrates how the vast scale of the Imperium allows for entities that are simultaneously connected to and separate from its authority. Understanding their origins requires recognizing that they were not created through a single founding edict, but through accumulation of circumstance. War, distance, and necessity forged a brotherhood that preserved the genetic and tactical legacy of the Raven Guard, while discarding the structures that no longer served their survival. Their story begins not with rebellion, but with a mission, as an unrecorded continuation of a legion that believed it had already accounted for all its sons. Operational records that can be cross-referenced to this force reveal a pattern of adaptation rarely seen among formally sanctioned chapters. Their most distinctive characteristic is not a single piece of wargear or heraldic device, but a systemic preference for modification over replacement. Equipment issued during earlier eras of the Imperium was retained far beyond expected service life, repeatedly altered to meet changing environmental and tactical requirements. This produced an arsenal that appeared irregular to outside observers, yet internally followed a consistent philosophy of durability, familiarity, and independence from external supply. Armour systems in use among the Ashen Claws demonstrate extensive evidence of localized artificer work. Rather than maintaining strict adherence to a single mark classification, individual suits often incorporate components drawn from multiple historical patterns. Power distribution networks are rerouted for redundancy. Plating is reinforced at stress points, identified through repeated combat exposure, and helm sensoriums are recalibrated for long-duration reconnaissance rather than line engagement visibility. These changes indicate a force expecting to operate without immediate access to Forge World refurbishment. Surface finishing of their armour, while visually austere, serves practical battlefield functions. The pale, ash-like coloration reduces thermal contrast and particulate accumulation across arid or debris-saturated operational zones. Unlike ceremonial coatings maintained by Codex-compliant chapters, this finish is intentionally matte and frequently reapplied in the field using mineral-based compounds derived from local environments. The result is a protective layer that doubles as camouflage without reliance on complex manufacturing treatments. Weapon selection further reflects their operational doctrine. Standard bolter configurations are modified to enhance reliability under irregular maintenance conditions. Firing mechanisms are simplified, recoil assemblies reinforced, and ammunition feeds adjusted to tolerate variations in propellant quality. Surviving logs suggest that the Ashen Claws prioritize weapons that can be serviced by their own armourers using limited fabrication infrastructure. This self-reliance reduces vulnerability to logistical disruption, but requires constant technical familiarity among the warriors themselves. Close combat armaments are maintained with similar intent. Bladed weapons are frequently rebalanced or reforged to accommodate individual fighting styles, developed over decades or centuries of use. Rather than rotating through standardized issue, a warrior may retain the same primary weapon across much of his service life, gradually altering its weight distribution and edge profile as battlefield experience dictates. Such continuity fosters an unusually intimate relationship between wielder and instrument, reinforcing the culture of personal accountability within their ranks. Range support elements rely on mobility rather than emplacement. Heavy weapons are configured for rapid deployment and withdrawal, often mounted on adaptable harness systems instead of fixed platforms. This approach allows fire support to accompany infiltration forces without sacrificing concealment. Engagement reports consistently describe short-duration bombardment, followed by immediate relocation, denying adversaries the opportunity to respond with counter-battery fire. Their fleet assets embody the same principles observed in personal equipment. Vessels under their command exhibit extensive internal restructuring intended to maximize endurance. Cargo holds are subdivided into modular fabrication spaces capable of producing spare components, munitions casings, and basic mechanical assemblies. These shipboard manufactories do not rival Mechanicus facilities in sophistication, yet they enable sustained operation far from established supply routes. Engine maintenance protocols emphasize accessibility over efficiency. Components subject to frequent wear are deliberately exposed within service corridors to allow rapid replacement without dry dock intervention. While such arrangements would be considered inelegant by orthodox standards, they significantly reduce the time required to restore operational readiness after extended translation or combat damage. The Ashen Claws also demonstrate a distinctive approach to reconnaissance technology. Auspex arrays are calibrated for passive detection and long-range pattern analysis rather than aggressive scanning. This minimizes the electronic signature of their presence while enabling gradual mapping of contested regions. Data collected through these methods is stored locally rather than transmitted continuously, reflecting a persistent caution regarding signal interception. Communications equipment is correspondingly restrained. Burst transmissions, encrypted through archaic yet resilient cipher systems, are favored over sustained astropathic dialogue. This practice limits both exposure and dependence upon Imperial relay networks. It also reinforces their operational autonomy, as decisions must be made without expectation of external guidance. In matters of transport and deployment, the Ashen Claws maintain a preference for strike craft configured for precision insertion. These vessels are stripped of non-essential ornamentation and modified to reduce detection during atmospheric entry. Internal layouts prioritize rapid disembarkation and equipment transfer, allowing squads to transition from void to surface engagement within minimal time. The emphasis is consistently placed on surprise, concentration of force, and immediate disengagement once objectives are achieved. Training methodologies reinforce the effective use of such equipment. Surviving instructional fragments indicate that warriors are conditioned to function in dispersed formations, capable of operating independently for prolonged intervals. Each individual is expected to understand not only combat roles, but also field repair procedures, navigation techniques, and resource acquisition strategies. This broad skill distribution reduces reliance on specialized support personnel. Their tactical identity therefore emerges from a synthesis of stealth heritage and frontier necessity. Engagements are rarely pursued for territorial expansion. Instead, they are executed to neutralize threats, secure materials, or enforce deterrence within regions under their protection. Once the required outcome is achieved, forces withdraw rather than consolidate visible control. This behavior has contributed to their ambiguous reputation, as many Imperial observers encounter only the aftermath of their actions rather than the warriors themselves. Logistical records recovered from Allied human settlements suggest that the Ashen Claws maintain calculated resource exchanges rather than formal tithes. Materials requested tend to be industrially practical, including raw metals, machine components, and void-capable fuel stocks. Items associated with ceremonial or ecclesiastical use are notably absent from these requisitions, underscoring their utilitarian outlook. Medical and gene seed preservation practices appear conservative but effective. Without direct oversight from the Adeptus Mechanicus, they rely on inherited knowledge preserved since the Legion era. Apothecarian facilities aboard their vessels are described as compact yet meticulously maintained, prioritizing genetic stability above expansion. The measured pace of recruitment implied by these arrangements suggests deliberate avoidance of the rapid induction methods that once destabilized their lineage. This restraint extends to their broader strategic posture. The Ashen Claws rarely commit their full strength to a single engagement, preferring distributed operations that maintain a reserve capability at all times. Such caution may stem from historical memory of near annihilation during the Heresy era, shaping a doctrine that values survival as a prerequisite for continued service. Collectively, these traits form a coherent operational ecosystem. Every modification, from armor plating to fleet configuration, supports a mode of existence defined by distance from Imperial infrastructure and distrust of dependence upon it. They are neither technologically regressive nor innovatively expansive. Instead, they refine what they possess, maintaining a stable equilibrium between preservation and adaptation. The result is a force that appears archaic when compared to the standardized precision of later imperial institutions, yet remains remarkably resilient. Their weapons fire reliably, their ships endure, their warriors require little beyond what they already carry. In an Imperium where supply lines often determine victory or defeat, such self-sufficiency constitutes a strategic advantage that has allowed them to persist in regions where more formally supported forces might falter. These distinctive characteristics do not represent deviation for its own sake, but rather the cumulative outcome of centuries spent operating beyond the assumptions embedded in codex-based logistics. The Ashen Claws fight with tools shaped by necessity, maintained through experience and trusted because they have never had the luxury of trusting anything else. Behavioral analysis drawn from long-term observation indicates that the Ashen Claws possess a collective temperament shaped less by formal indoctrination and more by inherited memory of abandonment and survival. Their psychological profile remains broadly consistent with Raven Guard lineage traits, including heightened patience, preference for observation before action, and a controlled expression of aggression. However, these qualities are expressed with noticeably reduced emphasis on hierarchical obedience. Where Codex-compliant brethren interpret discipline through rigid structural adherence, the Ashen Claws interpret discipline through demonstrated competence and reliability. Individual warriors are conditioned to view authority as functional rather than symbolic. Command is respected when it produces results, and maintained only so long as it remains tactically justified. This creates a culture in which initiative is not merely permitted but expected. Squad leaders are accustomed to making independent operational decisions without awaiting sanction from distant superiors, a necessity born from centuries of isolation where communication delays could span months or years. Their interpersonal conduct toward non-Astartes populations is pragmatic and restrained. They do not cultivate the overtly mythic presence often associated with Imperial Space Marines. Testimonies from frontier settlers describe interactions that are brief, direct, and devoid of ceremonial rhetoric. Assistance is rendered efficiently, followed by withdrawal. Gratitude, worship, or attempts at prolonged contact are neither encouraged nor acknowledged. The Ashen Claws appear to regard themselves not as rulers or icons, but as instruments performing a defined task. This detachment should not be mistaken for hostility. Evidence suggests a consistent pattern of protective action toward the human communities within their operational sphere. Threats are eliminated with disproportionate force, and defensive interventions are executed without demand for ideological conformity beyond basic cooperation. Their loyalty to humanity, rather than to the administrative structure of the Imperium, appears to form the foundation of their identity. Religious observance among the Ashen Claws is notably austere. While they acknowledge the Emperor as the ultimate origin of their purpose, their practices lack the elaborate liturgy common in later Imperial institutions. Devotional expression is internalized as duty fulfilled through action. Chaplaincy roles exist, but their function is closer to preservation of historical memory and ethical cohesion than to ritual leadership. The absence of extensive shrine culture further illustrates their rejection of unnecessary logistical burden. Organizationally, the Ashen Claws resist precise classification within the standard Adeptus Astartes framework. They do not present themselves as a codex chapter, nor do they display the fragmentation typical of Renegade warbands. Their structure resembles an expeditionary force that never concluded its campaign. Command elements coordinate through consensus informed by seniority and battlefield record, rather than through strictly defined company hierarchies. Fleet disposition reinforces this interpretation. Assets are distributed to allow semi-autonomous task groups capable of operating independently for extended periods. These groups share intelligence and resources when contact is feasible, yet they are not reliant upon centralized governance to function effectively. Such decentralization ensures continuity even if one element is lost, mirroring survival strategies observed in reconnaissance-based Legions Astartes deployments during the Great Crusade. Relations with the wider Imperium remain deliberately ambiguous. There is no substantial record of open conflict between the Ashen Claws and Imperial authorities, yet neither is there evidence of sustained cooperation. When contact occurs, it is typically transactional and temporary. Administratum officials have occasionally attempted to categorize them formally, only to encounter insufficient data or the sudden absence of the subjects in question. This ambiguity has generated ongoing debate within Imperial scholarship regarding their status. Some archivists argue that they represent an unregistered successor chapter that never completed formal recognition. Others contend that their refusal to integrate places them outside legitimate sanction, despite the absence of heretical conduct. No definitive judgment has been universally enforced, likely due to the minimal strategic value of pursuing a force that neither rebels nor seeks inclusion. From a cultural perspective, the Ashen Claws demonstrate a rare example of Astartes' identity shaped primarily by environment rather than doctrine. Removed from the institutional gravity of Terra and Mars, they evolved according to the pressures of frontier warfare. Their traditions emphasize adaptability, memory of origin, and distrust of dependence. The resulting ethos blends Legion-era pragmatism with a survivalist mentality seldom preserved elsewhere in the Imperium. Psychological endurance is a defining trait. Generations of warriors have served without expectation of recognition, reinforcement, or historical acknowledgement. This absence of external validation appears to have fostered an inwardly anchored sense of purpose. They measure success not through honor rolls or recorded crusades, but through continued existence and the stability of the regions under their watch. Strategically, their presence illustrates both the strengths and limitations of Imperial scale. The Imperium's vastness allows forces like the Ashen Claws to persist unmonitored, yet that same vastness prevents easy reintegration once divergence has occurred. They occupy a liminal space, genetically and culturally tied to the Raven Guard, while operationally distinct from any modern successor lineage. In evaluating their overall alignment, available evidence supports the conclusion that they remain loyal to the foundational ideals of the Imperium without subscribing to its later institutional expressions. They fight enemies of mankind, preserve human settlements, and maintain reverence for their origin, yet they do so according to self-determined parameters. This selective continuity complicates attempts to define them using conventional categories such as loyalist, renegade, or independent. The Ashen Claws therefore represent a living remnant of an earlier mode of Astartes warfare, one that predates the full codification of the Imperium's military and religious systems. Their continued operation demonstrates how the legacy of the legions can persist in altered form when separated from the structures that sought to standardize them. Any final assessment must acknowledge that they are neither an error nor an aberration, but a product of historical momentum. Created during crisis, isolated by circumstance, and sustained through deliberate adaptation, they endure as a functional anomaly within the Imperial Order. Their existence challenges the assumption that all Space Marine forces must conform to a single evolutionary path. They remain what they were forced to become during the long aftermath of the Horus Heresy. Not rebels, not exemplars, a self-reliant brotherhood shaped by loss, distance, and continuity of purpose. Fragmentary administrator memoranda originating from trade census reviews along the northern reaches of the Segmentum Pacificus contain repeated annotations referencing irregular protection patterns. These annotations do not initially name a responsible authority. Instead, they describe statistically improbable reductions in piracy, xenos predation, and internal rebellion within systems that otherwise lack a formal Imperial garrison. Early analysts categorized these developments as anomalies in threat projection models, attributing them to environmental isolation or underreported population density. Subsequent audits, conducted several centuries apart, identified recurring signatures associated with these stabilized regions. Shipping losses declined sharply for defined intervals, only to return to expected levels once vessels moved beyond certain loosely mapped coordinates. Administratum logisticians concluded that an unregistered enforcement body was exerting intermittent control over transit corridors. The inability to assign this presence to a recognized chapter or crusade fleet resulted in the creation of provisional designations within internal ledgers. These designations were rarely preserved beyond localized use, contributing to a long pattern of rediscovery without institutional memory. From a purely logistical standpoint, the most striking characteristic attributed to the Ashen Claws was the absence of conventional supply requisitions. Administratum supply chains rely upon predictable cycles of tithe exchange, munitions distribution, and equipment replacement. In regions associated with Ashen Claw activity, these cycles showed no corresponding demand. Material consumption occurred without record of authorized allocation. This discrepancy prompted investigations into possible black market diversion networks, though no sustained evidence of criminal infrastructure was found. Data recovered from compliant planetary governments suggests a different mechanism. Rather than receiving standardized tithes for onward transfer to Imperial authorities, certain frontier worlds entered into direct material exchange agreements. These arrangements emphasized raw industrial output such as unrefined metals, promethium derivatives, and machine components rather than finished goods. Administratum observers later theorized that this pattern indicated localized manufacturing performed by the Astartes themselves, bypassing the broader Imperial logistical lattice. Such independence presented both advantages and administrative concerns. On one hand, the presence of a self-sustaining defense force reduced the need to dispatch Imperial Guard formations to otherwise marginal systems. This conserved manpower for more strategically vital theatres. On the other hand, the inability to regulate or audit such a force introduced uncertainty into long-term resource planning. Administratum doctrine depends upon predictability. The Ashen Claws introduced variables that could not be easily quantified. Mechanicus exploratory delegations dispatched under the justification of technological survey recorded similarly ambiguous impressions. Surviving reports describe encountering warships of considerable antiquity, maintained in unexpectedly stable condition. Machine spirits were characterized as austere but disciplined, lacking many of the augmentation rights typically layered onto vessels maintained within major Forge World networks. Engineers noted evidence of repeated mechanical refitting performed without standardized template adherence, yet executed with high levels of technical competence. These findings generated cautious respect within certain Mechanicus circles. While deviation from standard template construct orthodoxy is normally condemned, the modifications observed were largely conservative in nature. They did not attempt radical innovation. Instead, they extended operational lifespan through redundancy and simplification. Some Magi interpreted this as an example of practical knowledge preservation dating back to Legion-era engineering traditions, relatively untouched by subsequent doctrinal rigidity. Other factions within the Mechanicus expressed unease. The lack of direct oversight meant that sacred technologies were being maintained outside the ritual hierarchy that legitimizes their use. Even when no overt tech heresy was identified, the absence of proper sanction created theological tension. A machine properly maintained must also be properly venerated. Whether the Ashen Claws fulfilled these rights to acceptable standards remained impossible to verify. Quantitative assessments compiled from long-range auger telemetry suggest that their fleet size remained deliberately limited. Rather than expanding through acquisition or construction of large capital vessels, the Ashen Claws appear to have concentrated on maintaining a modest number of highly serviceable ships. Administratum analysts interpreted this restraint as evidence of resource equilibrium. Expansion would require integration into broader supply systems, undermining their independence. Stability ensured longevity. Trade flow mapping further indicates that regions under their intermittent protection experienced unusual economic continuity. While not prosperous by core world standards, these systems avoided the catastrophic collapses common to unguarded frontiers. Agricultural output remained steady, population decline stabilized, and infrastructure degradation progressed at a slower rate than predictive models anticipated. Administratum scholars cautiously concluded that the Ashen Claws functioned as a form of decentralized risk mitigation, absorbing threats before they could escalate into crises requiring Imperial intervention. Despite these benefits, official recognition remained consistently withheld. Granting formal status would require full bureaucratic integration, including gene seed audits, fleet registration, and tithe normalization. Attempts to initiate such processes repeatedly failed due to lack of sustained contact. The Ashen Claws did not refuse outright. They simply did not remain present long enough for negotiations to progress beyond preliminary stages. Mechanicus Analytics also identified a pattern of technological conservatism, extending into armament use. Energy signatures recorded during observed engagements corresponded to older weapon patterns maintained at high efficiency rather than newly fabricated systems. This suggested an operational philosophy centered on maintaining known reliability rather than pursuing incremental advancement. For the Mechanicus, this behavior was paradoxical. It demonstrated reverence for functional continuity, while disregarding the hierarchical structures normally required to legitimize that continuity. Speculative commentary preserved in marginalia of several reports proposes that the Ashen Claws represent a closed logistical ecosystem. Raw materials are extracted or received, processed through localized fabrication capabilities, and reintegrated into their own maintenance cycles without entering Imperial distribution networks. Such a system would be inefficient at scale, yet highly resilient in isolation, mirroring survival strategies observed in long-duration exploratory fleets during the early Imperium. Administratum risk evaluations periodically revisited the question of compliance. Each review reached broadly similar conclusions. The Ashen Claws neither drain Imperial resources nor obstruct Imperial governance in adjacent sectors. Their activities reduce external threats and impose minimal administrative burden, but their unpredictable movements prevent reliable coordination. As a result, they are categorized as a tolerated irregularity rather than an actionable concern. In aggregate, the impressions recorded by both the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus portray a force that exists adjacent to Imperial systems rather than within them. Their logistical model rejects centralization, while maintaining enough structural familiarity to avoid classification as deviant. To bureaucratic observers, this produces a persistent analytical discomfort. They are understandable in function, yet resistant to incorporation, beneficial in outcome, yet incompatible with standard frameworks of control. This duality has ensured that, across millennia of record-keeping, references to the Ashen Claws appear only as scattered entries, rediscovered whenever their activities intersect with Imperial interests, then fading once more into statistical background. Administratum conflict ledgers and Mechanicus observational addenda contain scattered references to engagements attributed, either directly or by inference, to the Ashen Claws. These records rarely originate from primary declaration. Instead, they are reconstructed from shipping loss reversals, emergency astropathic signals abruptly terminated, or battlefield surveys conducted long after hostilities concluded. As a result, most engagements lack formal campaign titles and are instead catalogued by location, date approximation, and material aftermath. One of the earliest such incidents is believed to have occurred during the later centuries of the 31st millennium, when several frontier mining systems reported coordinated raids by unidentified Xenos Corsair elements. Surviving cargo manifests show repeated disruptions, followed by an abrupt cessation of hostile activity without the arrival of Imperial Navy task forces. Survey teams dispatched decades later found debris fields consistent with precision strike warfare. Hull fragments recovered from the void displayed patterns of close-range boarding action followed by localized reactor breach, a method associated with Astartes' assault doctrine rather than naval bombardment. No declaration of compliance action was ever filed, yet population retention within those systems stabilized immediately afterward. Administratum historians infer that this engagement marked one of the earliest sustained demonstrations of Ashen Claw intervention as a regional defense force operating independently of Imperial command. Centuries later, during an interval of heightened orc migration across several poorly charted subsectors, fragmented astropathic pleas for aid describe greenskin forces encountering resistance disproportionate to the defensive capabilities of the targeted worlds. Transmissions mention sudden atmospheric insertions conducted without warning, followed by the rapid elimination of orc leadership structures. Subsequent greenskin activity degraded into disorganized violence before collapsing entirely. Mechanicus reconnaissance vessels arriving generations afterward detected widespread but methodical destruction of orc infrastructure, including scrap fortifications dismantled rather than obliterated. Analysts proposed that salvageable materials had been reclaimed. This detail reinforced the theory that the Ashen Claws did not merely destroy threats, but systematically harvested resources necessary for their continued autonomy. In the 35th millennium, several Chartist captains filed restricted navigation warnings regarding a region marked by intermittent but intense void warfare. These warnings describe unidentified strike cruisers engaging renegade human fleets involved in unsanctioned trade and slave acquisition. Unlike Imperial punitive expeditions, which typically culminated in system-wide sanction, these confrontations were narrow in scope. Enemy vessels were neutralized, command crews eliminated, and surviving auxiliary craft driven from the region rather than pursued to extinction. Administratum legal scholars reviewing these reports noted an unusual restraint. The pattern suggested enforcement of localized order rather than doctrinal purification. Worlds previously exploited by renegade forces resumed normalized trade shortly thereafter, again without formal annexation into greater Imperial administration. The most extensively documented conflict tentatively associated with the Ashen Claws emerges from Mechanicus Explorator archives dating to the late 38th millennium. An exploratory convoy translating into an unregistered system encountered the remnants of a protracted ground war already concluded. Auspex readings detected extensive tunnel collapses, vitrified defensive positions, and abandoned bioforms identified as remnants of a minor Tyrannid splinter presence. What distinguished this site from typical Tyrannid consumption zones was the absence of total biospheric stripping. The ecosystem, though scarred, remained viable. Mechanicus xenobiologists attached to the mission hypothesized that the invading organisms had been deliberately contained and eradicated before reaching critical mass. Scattered pick captures recovered from damaged survey drones depict power-armored figures employing controlled incendiary tactics and sequential fallback positions, consistent with calculated attritional warfare rather than frontal resistance. No gene seed retrieval teams were recorded, no victory proclamation was issued, yet the pattern of engagement aligned closely with Ravengard-derived tactical doctrine adapted for sustained independent action. During the early 41st millennium, Administratum traffic monitors again recorded statistical irregularities along several minor trade corridors. Piracy indices fell to near zero despite absence of naval patrol assignments. Merchant testimony from this era provides rare descriptive accounts, though heavily redacted. Witnesses describe pale armoured warriors conducting inspections of captured raider vessels, removing navigational data, then destroying the ships with deliberate finality. These actions appear to have functioned as a deterrence mechanism. Within a single century, recorded pirate activity in adjacent systems migrated elsewhere, suggesting that the Ashen Claws favoured displacement of instability rather than permanent occupation. Some Mechanicus commentaries speculate that these repeated localized conflicts formed part of an unarticulated territorial maintenance strategy. Rather than expanding influence, the Ashen Claws may have defined a fluctuating perimeter within which threats were preemptively eliminated. This interpretation remains conjectural, as no strategic charter has ever been recovered to confirm intentional boundary enforcement. Later records from the closing centuries of the 41st millennium reference clashes with unidentified chaos, aligned warbands attempting to establish footholds in isolated systems. Evidence consists primarily of corrupted vox logs describing sudden assaults executed under conditions of electronic silence. Post-conflict examination revealed eradication of heretical infrastructure with minimal collateral devastation to civilian populations. The precision of these actions led some administratum tacticians to conclude that the Ashen Claws prioritize elimination of command and corruption vectors before ideological contamination can spread. Such methodology mirrors early Legion counterinsurgency practices rather than the overwhelming crusade model favoured by later Imperial doctrine. Across all these engagements, a consistent operational pattern emerges. The Ashen Claws do not wage wars of conquest, nor do they maintain garrisons after victory. Their conflicts are finite interventions characterized by rapid appearance, decisive violence, and immediate withdrawal. Documentation repeatedly shows that by the time Imperial authorities become aware of the threat, it has already been resolved. This has produced a paradox within administratum military historiography. Numerous regions owe their continued survival to actions never formally acknowledged. Battlefields exist without campaign names. Enemy forces vanish without recorded deployment orders. Analysts attempting to compile a comprehensive chronicle encounter only disconnected events linked by tactical similarity and geographic recurrence. It is therefore believed, though not conclusively proven, that the Ashen Claws engage only when conditions directly threaten the stability of the territories from which they draw sustenance and recruits. Conflicts outside this sphere receive no response, reinforcing the perception that their strategic priorities are intensely localized. The absence of grand crusades or sector-wide offensives should not be interpreted as inactivity. Instead, their history is defined by a sequence of contained wars, each significant to those who survived them, yet too limited in scale to alter Imperial macro-history. In aggregate, however, these interventions have maintained a chain of frontier systems that might otherwise have fallen into permanent darkness. Post-conflict documentation attributed to regions influenced by the Ashen Claws demonstrates a pattern that differs markedly from outcomes typically associated with large-scale Imperial intervention. Administratum recovery teams dispatched months, decades, or in some cases centuries after reported hostilities consistently observed environments that, while damaged, retained functional continuity. Infrastructure was rarely annihilated outright. Instead, damage appeared selective, concentrated on hostile assets, supply concentrations or command loci. Civilian production centres, water purification systems and transit networks were often left intact or only minimally disrupted. This selectivity complicated administratum reconstruction models. Standard war recovery assumes widespread devastation followed by massive material requisition. In systems believed to have been defended by the Ashen Claws, requested aid was comparatively small. Local authorities frequently reported that primary threats had been neutralized before planetary-scale collapse occurred. As a result, these worlds returned to taxable productivity faster than predictive algorithms anticipated, creating irregular surpluses within subsector tithe calculations. Such irregularities prompted deeper analysis into the operational consequences of Ashen Claw warfare. Administratum logisticians concluded that the Force appears to prioritize what internal memoranda term threat excision, rather than territorial reclamation. Engagements are designed to remove destabilizing agents, while preserving the existing human environment as a viable support base. This approach produces fewer immediate demands on Imperial relief networks, but also denies the administratum the opportunity to formalize control through reconstruction oversight. Mechanicus aftermath surveys yield similarly distinctive observations. Battlefield remnants show extensive evidence of controlled munitions expenditure. Energy discharge patterns indicate calculated application of force, calibrated to achieve mechanical failure without excessive environmental contamination. Where heavy ordnance was used, it was deployed in confined envelopes, often combined with structural sabotage to collapse hostile fortifications inward rather than scatter debris across surrounding terrain. Engineers reviewing these sites frequently noted the absence of experimental or unfamiliar weapon signatures. The Ashen Claws appear to rely on established technologies maintained at peak function, rather than deploying newly sanctified devices. From a Mechanicus standpoint, this suggests a doctrine centered on reliability and predictability, minimizing variables that could compromise operational independence. Recovered equipment fragments occasionally found on such battlefields show signs of deliberate removal of identifying machine marks before abandonment. This practice has generated debate within Mechanicus Scholastica. Some interpret it as an attempt to avoid doctrinal scrutiny. Others argue it represents a pragmatic measure intended to prevent technological tracing that could expose supply vulnerabilities. No consensus has been reached. The aftermath of their interventions also reveals an unusual absence of occupation structures. Administratum observers consistently report that no permanent fortresses, shrines, or command installations remain once hostilities conclude. Instead, only transient staging areas can be identified, often dismantled prior to withdrawal. This reinforces the assessment that the Ashen Claws do not seek to anchor their authority through physical presence, but through recurring demonstration of capability. Economic data gathered from affected systems further supports this interpretation. Trade resumes under local governance rather than transitioning to direct Imperial supervision. While such autonomy would normally trigger compliance review, the continued remittance of baseline tithes has historically mitigated punitive response. Administratum officials, faced with functioning worlds that require no additional expenditure, often classify these situations as administratively resolved despite lacking formal integration. From a strategic perspective, both Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus analysts recognize advantages within this model, even while acknowledging its incompatibility with orthodox Imperial governance. A self-regulating defense entity reduces the burden on already strained military and industrial resources. Frontier sectors stabilized in this manner demand fewer crusades, fewer emergency levies, and fewer redistributions of Forge World output. Yet this benefit introduces long-term uncertainty. Because the Ashen Claws operate outside standardized reporting structures, their future capacity cannot be reliably forecast. Administratum projections rely upon measurable strength ratios and replenishment cycles. The Ashen Claws provide no such transparency. Their losses, recruitment rates, and manufacturing capabilities remain unknown, forcing planners to treat them as both asset and variable risk. Mechanicus authorities likewise express divided evaluation. Some Magi regard the Ashen Claws as preservers of an older, purer application of martial technology, unencumbered by excessive ritual expansion. Others caution that unsupervised continuity risks gradual doctrinal drift, even if no deviation has yet been proven. The lack of regularized communion with Mars leaves their technical evolution unverified. Joint assessments drafted during later millennia attempt to reconcile these views by categorizing the Ashen Claws as a self-contained auxiliary phenomenon. They are neither fully aligned with Imperial command structures nor actively divergent from them. Their existence represents a parallel expression of Astartes' function, one that fulfills similar objectives through methods shaped by isolation rather than regulation. The long-term aftermath of their recorded wars demonstrates consistent regional stabilization paired with administrative opacity. Systems touched by their intervention tend to survive, records explaining that survival remain incomplete. This combination has led to their quiet toleration within multiple branches of Imperial bureaucracy. To challenge their autonomy would require resources disproportionate to any perceived irregularity. To ignore them entirely would overlook the measurable reduction of threats along their sphere of action. Consequently, the prevailing Administratum and Mechanicus perspective is neither endorsement nor condemnation, but cautious acknowledgement. The Ashen Claws are treated as an enduring anomaly whose results justify their continued existence, even if their methods remain outside the structures designed to define and control the Imperium's many defenders. Inquisitorial references to the Ashen Claws are markedly fewer than those preserved within Administratum or Mechanicus archives, yet the surviving material carries a distinctly different tone. Where other Imperial bodies attempted classification, the Inquisition approached the subject through scrutiny of deviation, motive, and potential doctrinal risk. The earliest sealed notations appear within dispersed Ordo Xenos and Ordo Hereticus observation files, typically appended to unrelated investigations after encountering unexplained patterns of intervention within frontier regions. Initial impressions recorded by inquisitorial observers emphasize the difficulty of establishing intent. The Ashen Claws consistently act in ways that align with the preservation of humanity and the destruction of alien or heretical threats. However, they do so without submitting to investigation, without requesting sanction, and without leaving behind evidence sufficient for comprehensive review. To the Inquisition, this combination produces an operational profile that is neither exonerating nor indicting, but persistently unresolved. Several observers note that the chapter's behaviour resembles that of a force prosecuting a campaign long since removed from Imperial oversight, continuing its mandate according to criteria that may no longer exist within current strategic doctrine. This has led to speculation that their guiding operational philosophy derives from interpretations of authority dating back to the immediate aftermath of the Horus Heresy, preserved internally without subsequent correction or reaffirmation. Direct encounters between inquisitorial agents and the Ashen Claws are exceedingly rare, and most accounts survive only as partial transcripts or second-hand testimony. In those instances where communication was attempted, responses were described as formal, concise, and devoid of the defensive hostility often displayed by renegade groups. The Ashen Claws neither resisted inquiry nor accommodated it. They answered only questions deemed operationally relevant and disengaged once the perceived necessity of dialogue ended. Such interactions generated a recurring observation within Ordo records. The Ashen Claws do not behave as though they reject Imperial authority. Rather, they appear to operate as though they are no longer subject to its administrative expression. This distinction, subtle yet significant, has complicated efforts to determine whether their independence constitutes technical non-compliance or merely anachronistic continuity. More unusual are the environmental findings occasionally associated with their departures. Investigative teams arriving after reported sightings frequently document evidence of meticulous data removal. Cogitator banks are purged with precision rather than destroyed. Navigational logs are altered to obscure translation vectors. In several cases, abandoned installations show signs of having been cleansed of identifying genetic material, suggesting a deliberate effort to prevent retrospective analysis of Ashen Claw presence. The motivation for such actions remains unconfirmed. Some inquisitors interpret them as a defensive measure designed to avoid bureaucratic entanglement that could compromise their autonomy. Others consider the possibility that the chapter safeguards knowledge or resources it believes the Imperium would mismanage or misuse. No recovered documentation has substantiated either theory. There are also records describing operational foresight bordering on prescience, though never explicitly categorized as psychic phenomena. Threats neutralized by the Ashen Claws often coincide with dangers only later recognized by Imperial authorities. Investigators reviewing these timelines have questioned how the chapter identified such risks without access to the extensive intelligence networks available to the Inquisition. Theories range from exceptionally disciplined reconnaissance methodology to the retention of ancient surveillance practices no longer widely employed. Notably absent from all examined material is evidence of chaotic corruption, Xenos collaboration, or ideological divergence from core Imperial tenets. Gene seed samples recovered indirectly through battlefield remains, though extremely limited in number, show no detectable mutation beyond expected variants. This absence of heresy has repeatedly stayed inquisitorial escalation, as there exists no doctrinal justification for sanction beyond administrative irregularity. Even so, the Inquisition remains cautious. A force of Adeptus Astartes operating indefinitely outside Imperial command represents a theoretical risk, regardless of present loyalty. Several sealed memoranda argue that autonomy sustained over millennia could, under altered leadership or circumstance, shift towards separatism without warning. Counter-arguments emphasize that the Ashen Claws have had ample opportunity to rebel and have shown no inclination to do so. Another unexplained element involves the chapter's apparent selectivity and visibility. They have been recorded assisting isolated human populations with notable consistency, yet have ignored neighbouring systems undergoing comparable crises. This selective engagement has led some investigators to suspect the existence of internal criteria or obligations unknown to Imperial authorities. Whether these criteria are strategic, historical, or symbolic remains speculative. Ordo archivists reviewing these patterns frequently conclude their reports with variations of the same assessment. The Ashen Claws do not fit the behavioural models used to identify threats to the Imperium, yet neither can they be confidently integrated into its hierarchy of trust. Their actions align with loyalty. Their methods reflect independence carried to an extreme rarely tolerated within Imperial structure. The cumulative impression preserved in inquisitorial documentation is therefore one of watchful acceptance. Surveillance is maintained at a distance. Direct interference is avoided unless evidence of doctrinal deviation emerges. The Ashen Claws are regarded less as suspects than as an unresolved case study, a remnant of an earlier age whose continued existence challenges the Inquisition's mandate to categorize, judge, and when necessary, purge. They are observed, recorded, and ultimately left to continue, not because they are fully understood, but because every attempt to define them has produced more questions than certainty. A number of sealed inquisitorial files expand upon irregularities only briefly acknowledged in earlier observational records. These documents, circulated primarily among select members of the Ordo Hereticus and Ordo Xenos, catalogue encounters that resist conventional classification. While none provide conclusive evidence of doctrinal violation, their cumulative weight has ensured the Ashen Claws remain under periodic review, despite the absence of actionable charges. One recurring anomaly concerns the chapter's pattern of arrival and withdrawal. Multiple reports describe Ashen Claw vessels translating into systems without registering through standard astropathic warning channels or naval auger detection thresholds expected for ships of their displacement. These translations are not invisible, but they are unusually difficult to track retroactively. Attempts to reconstruct their warp ingress vectors often yield contradictory readings, as if the vessels deliberately employed erratic translation points designed to prevent long-range triangulation. Some inquisitorial savants theorize this practice is an intentional counter-surveillance doctrine developed during the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, when loyalist forces themselves feared infiltration and reprisal. Others speculate that the Ashen Claws maintain navigational methodologies preserved from early Legion fleets that relied less upon fixed routes and more upon adaptive, experience-based warp cartography. Such methods, if true, would be nearly impossible for modern Imperial institutions to replicate without comparable historical continuity. Documented surface encounters are similarly restrained and frequently mediated through intermediaries rather than direct engagement. In rare cases where inquisitorial representatives have attempted formal parley, the Ashen Claws appeared willing to acknowledge authority in principle while declining to submit to investigative procedure. One redacted transcript describes a meeting in which chapter representatives provided confirmation of their actions against a Xenos incursion, furnished limited tactical data, and then terminated the exchange once requests for gene seed audit were introduced. The presiding inquisitor recorded no hostility during the interaction, only an unwavering refusal to allow examination beyond what the chapter deemed operationally relevant. The report concludes with the assessment that coercion would likely have resulted in armed confrontation disproportionate to any investigatory benefit. Several sealed reports also address the unusual absence of relic culture within Ashen Claw holdings. Unlike most Adeptus Astartes chapters, they appear to maintain few ceremonial artifacts or publicly venerated war trophies. Investigators who gained limited access to abandoned staging areas found equipment maintained in functional condition, but devoid of the devotional embellishments normally associated with centuries of continuous service. This absence has prompted speculation that the chapter deliberately minimizes symbolic anchors to prevent stagnation or internal factionalism. Another interpretation suggests a cultural aversion to retrospective glorification, perhaps rooted in their origins during a period when survival outweighed commemoration. Without direct testimony, the matter remains unresolved. An additional anomaly emerges from demographic analysis of human populations residing within areas intermittently defended by the Ashen Claws. These societies display cultural continuity with early Imperial frontier traditions, including practical governance structures and reduced dependence on ecclesiarchal oversight. While still loyal to the Emperor, their religious expression tends toward subdued observance rather than elaborate ritualism. Inquisitorial sociologists debate whether this reflects passive influence exerted by the Ashen Claws or merely the natural evolution of isolated communities. No evidence suggests deliberate ideological shaping, yet the consistency of these patterns across multiple systems has been deemed noteworthy enough to warrant archival preservation. Isolated battlefield recoveries present further points of inquiry. On several occasions, inquisitorial retrieval teams discovered enemy command centers dismantled with surgical precision, their data cores extracted rather than destroyed. The absence of these cores has fueled conjecture that the Ashen Claws maintain their own intelligence repositories separate from Imperial data networks. If such archives exist, their contents and purpose remain entirely unknown. Some within the Order Xenos have raised the possibility that this information gathering represents a long-term strategic survey conducted according to criteria predating current inquisitorial mandates. Others caution that any parallel intelligence structure, even one aligned with human survival, constitutes a theoretical challenge to centralized authority. Without access to corroborating material, the debate has never progressed beyond internal discourse. Sealed appendices also reference several instances in which threats eliminated by the Ashen Claws were only later recognized as components of larger emerging dangers. Splinter infestations, minor heretical cult formations, and exploratory Xenos probes were neutralized before they could develop into crises detectable by conventional Imperial monitoring. The precision of this preemptive activity has led to speculation that the chapter exercises an intelligence network of surprising reach, though no agents or informants have ever been identified. Despite these unresolved questions, every investigation has ultimately encountered the same limiting factor. The Ashen Claws neither conceal themselves entirely nor permit sustained scrutiny. They remain accessible only in moments defined by necessity, after which they disengage and disperse beyond reliable tracking. Thus, the sealed reports do not present evidence of rebellion, mutation, or forbidden alliance. Instead, they describe a force whose operational opacity, cultural minimalism, and strategic independence produce effects that Imperial institutions struggle to interpret. The anomalies lie not in overt transgression, but in the persistence of a self-directed Astartes brotherhood that continues to function effectively without the frameworks designed to govern all others. The most restricted inquisitorial material concerning the Ashen Claws resides within classification strata rarely circulated beyond conclave-level review. These files do not contain dramatic revelations or singular incidents of heresy. Instead, they consist of longitudinal studies accumulated over millennia, attempting to answer a question that has never been formally voiced in open record. How does a force of Adeptus Astartes remain functionally loyal while existing almost entirely outside the Imperium's systems of control? One such document, compiled through comparative analysis of encounter logs spanning several centuries, concludes that the Ashen Claws exhibit what is termed stable divergence. They differ structurally, procedurally, and culturally from Codex-compliant chapters, yet this divergence has not progressed into doctrinal deviation. The report stresses that their separation appears to have reached an equilibrium state, maintained by self-imposed limitations rather than external enforcement. Investigators note that the chapter does not expand aggressively, does not recruit beyond sustainable levels, and does not seek political leverage among neighbouring systems. This restraint is interpreted as deliberate. By avoiding growth that would demand broader logistical integration, the Ashen Claws preserve the autonomy that defines them. At the same time, this limitation prevents them from evolving into a rival power structure, intentionally or otherwise. Another classified assessment examines their genetic and cultural continuity. Though opportunities to obtain samples have been rare, analysis of verified material confirms lineage consistent with Raven Guard derivation. showing no measurable corruption. The absence of mutation across such an extended period is itself considered unusual, given the environmental pressures typically encountered by isolated chapters. Some inquisitorial genitors attribute this stability to conservative operational doctrine that minimizes unnecessary exposure and preserves established biological integrity. A separate line of inquiry addresses the chapter's apparent lack of ideological ambition. Unlike renegade forces, which seek validation, dominion, or transformation, the Ashen Claws display no evidence of attempting to redefine their purpose. They neither reject the Imperium nor attempt to reform it. Their activities suggest adherence to an interpretation of duty so narrowly focused that broader institutional relationships have become irrelevant to their function. This characteristic has led certain inquisitors to characterize them as temporally displaced. They behave as though still operating under conditions of the early Imperium, when distant expeditionary elements were required to act without immediate oversight. In this view, the Ashen Claws are not resisting modern authority so much as continuing a mission whose administrative context has long since changed. Classified correspondence between Ordo representatives reveals periodic debate over whether forced reintegration should be attempted. Advocates argue that bringing the chapter fully into Imperial structure would eliminate uncertainties and grant access to their accumulated knowledge. Opponents counter that any such attempt would risk destabilizing a force that has demonstrated consistent, if unconventional, loyalty. The potential cost of confrontation is judged to outweigh any administrative gain. Several documents emphasize that the Ashen Claws have repeatedly acted in defense of human populations without seeking recognition, reward, or doctrinal validation. This absence of self-promotion is treated as a key indicator, distinguishing them from separatist entities. They do not appear to desire acknowledgement, only operational freedom. The final analytical summaries contained within these archives avoid definitive categorization. Instead, they recommend continued observation under a doctrine of non-interference unless measurable change occurs in behavior, genetic stability, or strategic scope. Inquisitorial presence within regions frequented by the Ashen Claws is to remain discreet, gathering information without provoking engagement. The concluding remarks of one particularly circulated memorandum encapsulate the prevailing inquisitorial stance. The Ashen Claws are neither to be trusted without reservation, nor condemned without cause. They represent a legacy condition of the Imperium, born of an era when survival demanded decentralization, and when not all forces could remain within the Emperor's direct gaze. As long as their actions continue to align with the preservation of mankind, they are to be regarded as a tolerated anomaly, watched but not pursued, acknowledged but not embraced. Their existence serves as a reminder that the Imperium is vast enough to contain contradictions, and that some of its defenders endure not because they conform, but because they never ceased fighting the wars they were created to wage.